Right, we're continuing where we were last week and talking about rebuttals to the Jesus myth. And I've got something here in the middle of my screen I need to move. And you recall last week we introduced some of the mythicists, and we talked about that we'd be looking at some of their claims about Horus and other pagan deities that they claim that Jesus is kind of a recycled story of. And we looked at Egyptian mythology and saw it really didn't match up, and it was a bunch of made up stuff largely. You might recall that they had a long list of sun gods that were supposed to be like Jesus, a sun god. We only went through one. Having researched one of them in detail, you can tell that there's not much point in chasing them all down. Plus those that have there's books and stuff on the topic that have gone through, and they've said, I think, like maybe it's in Habermas and Lacoma's book, maybe, where it mentions, or maybe another book, but where it says the only one that even seems to have something like a resurrection to make an argument from would be Osiris that we looked at. And that's when his wife flew him around him like a bird and got him to conceive magic. And then he becomes God of the underworld. So we're not going to go through all those. Plus, I don't want to do all the artwork of illustrating all the other deities that I already did on the Egyptian ones. And so then we introduced this idea that there was a bunch of lesser messiahs. So one argument is there were a bunch of pagan gods that didn't exist as people, and Jesus was a repeat of that. Another argument is there were a bunch of people that were lesser messiahs, and they're more historical than Jesus. So it's kind of a flip argument. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So Jesus of Nazareth and the supposedly more historical messiahs. And I wanted to share this just to see that people are talking about this. I came across this last night. It's from wisconsin.edu, from a physics class apparently. And this is a discussion page. And it says, someone said there's already a very compelling argument being made against the possibility of Jesus being a historical person. And then one of the students says, any interesting websites about the evidence for Jesus? And the person writing believes apparently Jesus never existed, and they put up a bunch of links. And here's some of the people we talked about: Robert Price, Richard Carrier, Earl Doherty, etc. So we talked about some of these last week. Today, we're going to be looking at a more recent fellow, David Fitzgerald. Last week, of course, we went through the Zeitgeist movie that just had a ton of nonsense in it. And hopefully you can see now why it was so rejected, you know, and the idea by historians, but it's gaining some popular traction. Richard Carrier, if you'd like me to go, I've talked some about him in the past. If you'd like me to go more detailed, because there's a bunch of detail, I'll be happy to do that in a further lesson. But if after this lesson, everybody's, you've heard enough of this, that's fine, I won't go there. But if you're interested, we can get into what Richard Carrier says. He is unique among some of them because most of them don't have a PhD, and he does in history. Earl Doherty, who doesn't, but Richard Carrier is repeating his ideas largely, wrote Jesus, Neither God Nor Man. But this is David Fitzgerald at the Myth Information Conference, some mythicists in Milwaukee. And this is about 5 years ago, if I recall. And he's going to be arguing, among a much of other things, that there were lesser messiahs that were more noticed in history. And so here he is. He's referring to his upcoming book, Jesus, Mything in Action. It's the Mythicist Survival Handbook, he says. And the purpose of this is he's wanting to equip the mythicists to answer the mainline atheists. Because mainline atheists don't respect the mythicist position because there's too much historical evidence Jesus existed. So your average atheist, your average secular historian knows Jesus existed, but he doesn't believe he was the Son of God. These guys are in a pickle because so much of academia doesn't accept what they say. And a lot of them are not academics. But they say that some of the people in academia will privately say, I agree with you. So again, things are changing a little bit. And you can see like on that wisconsin.edu page, you know, I assume that's probably at a university, judging from the pictures associated from the page. And there's some people buying into this. So in this particular speech, he's talking about how many of you have kind of gotten disdain from your fellow atheists for claiming Jesus didn't exist. And pretty much everybody raises their hands. So he says, I'm going to give you some arguments to equip you, you know, so that you can show other atheists Jesus didn't exist. Then he goes on to say, historians say that is because they just give credence to the biblical historians. And he says a lot of the biblical historians are conservative. And so of course they, you know, believe in Jesus. He said some of them teach at universities where you're supposed to believe in Jesus. So he tries to dismiss it that way. And it's just a traditional idea that people haven't gotten rid of. He quotes Robert Price here. The mythicist case has been rebutted. Really? When did that happen? The arguments of the mythicist camp have never been refuted. They have only been steadfastly ignored. Remember, he's one of the mythicists. And so Fitzgerald changes the question, why don't historians question Jesus' historicity? After pointing out some do, he says, why don't more question his historicity? Now, here's his argument that we're going to be looking at today. If you can see on the screen there, it says lesser messiahs. He says, we have so many loser messiahs and wannabe messiahs who weren't half as interesting as anything that Jesus does in the Gospels. But understand, he's saying these other messiahs were actually historical people. He's saying Jesus wasn't. But if a human being did the things that Jesus did, he should have been really famous. So these other guys, these real humans, these lesser messiahs, weren't half as interesting as anything that Jesus does in the Gospels. And yet every single one of these guys does something that Jesus completely failed to do. And that's make a dent in the historical record. So that's the argument we're going to be looking at today. Jesus of Nazareth and the more historical messiahs. He claims every single one of these guys does something Jesus completely failed to do, and that's make a dent in the historical record. Now, some of you already may be thinking, Josephus talks about Jesus. And they're going to say, no, Josephus didn't really do that. Tacitus talks about Jesus. They're going to say, well, he only got that information from Christians. You know, so they're going to try to dismiss the evidence that's there. I want you to watch how this goes. We're going to go through them. Simon of Perea. We're going to go through, and I'm going to put up here on the board the dents that they make in the historical record. But before I do that, let me suggest this. I'm going to show another screen if I can. Everybody else might not be able to see it, but I don't want to lose the thing. No, I've already lost the other thing. Yeah, here it is. Yeah. This is important to remember. Okay, so this is live science. For those of you out there, you probably can't see this screen, but you'll hear me read it. So this is live science last year. Who was Pontius Pilate? And it says, despite his biblical fame, little is known about Pilate. Only a small number of historical accounts and artifacts that date close to his lifetime survive today. My point here is this. Now let me get back to where we are. And can they see? Good. I didn't lose it. Most people in the first century didn't get recorded in history. Let's do a really, really simple illustration of that. Raise your hand if you had ancestors that were alive in the first century. Now, a couple of you didn't raise your hand. I'm telling you, you had ancestors that were alive in the first century. You know, some things I don't know, but I know that. What was their name? Do you think if you researched it, you could find? No, you don't have that many historical documents. And you didn't have like, the Nazareth Daily or the Jerusalem Post and kept it on file or on microfiche or something that you can go back and find that. Most people that lived at that time lived and died without getting recorded in history. So here's Pontius Pilate. You would never, ever have heard of Pontius Pilate if it were not for Jesus Christ. That's why Pontius Pilate is famous. Now you might say, well, maybe the mythicists say Pilate didn't exist. Oh no, they make arguments from Pilate. They say Pilate never would have done that. The kind of guy Pilate was, he never would have let the guilty guy go free and let them pressure him into killing the innocent guy. Well, when they start saying, we have no king but Caesar, and if you let him go, you're not a friend of Caesar, and Pilate starts thinking about the repercussions, you can see why he would cave in. But they absolutely believe Pilate was a historical character. Which do you think would be more likely to be noticed in Roman history? A Roman governor or the son of a carpenter in a far out district? So not everybody is going to get recorded in history, but Jesus is, and Pilate is. And one of the reasons we know about Pilate is because of Jesus. So let's go through these others. Simon of Perea. So this is from Livius.org, has a lot of historical stuff on it. I'm not going to read all of this. Don't expect to be able to read all that tiny print up there, and I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll kind of summarize it. So 4 BC, King Herod died. Herod the Great, the one that was building the temple, the one that kills the babies in Bethlehem. When that guy died, there were several revolts against this, the rule of his successor, Herod Archelaus. If you'll remember in Matthew chapter 2, Joseph is in Egypt and he hears Herod is dead, but then he finds out Archelaus is reigning in his stead. This is right at that time. There were some revolts. One of them was this guy. And we have here from Josephus, there was also Simon, who had been a slave of King Herod. In other respects, he was a comely person of tall and robust body. He was one that was much superior to others of his order, and he had things committed to his care. This man was elevated at the disorderly state of things and was so bold as to put a diadem on his head. So King Herod had died. He's one of the slaves. He's a big guy. He's a strong guy. And he was kind of in charge of some stuff, and he decides, I'm going to be king. The Romans came in and put a stop to that. He ends up getting his head cut off, and that's it. Tacitus mentions him. Tacitus says, at Herod's death, without waiting for imperial decision, a certain Simon usurped the title of king. He was dealt with by the governor of Syria, while the Jews were divided into 3 kingdoms by Herod's son. So let's kind of keep score here. Simon of Perea, his dent is that he is mentioned in Josephus and Tacitus. All right? Who's Josephus? He's a Jew. He's a Pharisee who was at the destruction of Jerusalem at the Jewish war between the Romans and the Jews, 66 to 70 AD. Afterwards, when he went over to the Roman side and trying to convince people, you need to give up, we're going to lose this, we kind of caused this, we need to serve the Romans. He was treated kindly by the Romans. He got to retire to Rome, and he wrote a history of the Jewish people. So he's a valuable source from the 1st century. Tacitus was a Roman senator and a historian, and he writes in the early 2nd century AD. Sometime after 110 AD. And so both of those historians mention Simon of Perea. There's his dent. And according to Mr. Fitzgerald, he did something Jesus never managed to do to get this much historical recognition. Here's a comment. Simon of Perea may have put a diadem on his head, and he caused enough trouble to make the Romans send in legions, but there's no indications he was considered the Messiah. Herod died. Somebody's going to get power. He tried to get it. And what were the sources? The two sources on Simon of Perea died around 4 BC, got his head lopped off, Flavius and Tacitus. All right, let's go to Ethronges, the shepherd. This is from Jewish Encyclopedia. He was a leader of the Jews during the insurrection under Archelaus, so same time period. He's a shepherd and a bold adventurer without any other claim to power but that of gigantic strength and stature. And then he had 4 big brothers, and they tried to get some power, and they were defeated. Okay, what are our historical sources? Josephus. So here we have Ethronges, the shepherd, and it's Josephus. Says nothing about Tacitus. Let's go to Judas of Galilee. So Judas of Galilee, about the year 6, Flavius Josephus says about him, there was one Judas, a Galilean of a city whose name was Gamala, who taking with him Zadok, a Pharisee, became zealous to draw them into revolt. Both said that this taxation was no better than an introduction to slavery. So he is a Jew from Galilee, and he doesn't like the taxes that are being imposed, and he says we need to revolt and not pay the taxes. The same things that the Pharisees were hoping Jesus would say, so that would get them out of the way. Well, he, of course, is going to be defeated. What's our source? Flavius Josephus and the book of Acts. So now we have another historical source. We've got the Bible. And of course, where is Judas the Galilean mentioned? Yeah, you remember where? It's when some of the Sanhedrin wants to kill Peter and the apostles, and Gamaliel, president of the Sanhedrin, says, wait a minute. If this is not from God, it's going to peter out, like Judas the Galilean. So he's mentioned 2 times. There's his dent, bam, Josephus, and bam, the Bible. All right, let's go to Theudas the magician. Theudas, there's some discrepancy on the date here. The Bible has him at one time, Josephus has him at another time. Since Luke lives earlier and is writing closer to the time than Josephus, I'm not going to do what most people do and throw out Luke and go for Josephus. Josephus is covering a lot of things, and he's writing, closer to like 100. Luke's writing almost 40 years before that. All right, but this Theudas, what it says about him, while Thaddeus was procurator of Judea, there was a certain charlatan named Theudas, and he persuaded a part of the people to take their effects with them and to follow him to the river Jordan, et cetera, et cetera. And he did say, it says here, he did claim to be the Messiah. And of course, there were people that claimed to be the Messiah. Simon Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century is another one. But what's our source? Josephus and Acts of the Apostles. So for Theudas, the magician, is Josephus and the Bible. All right, let's continue. The Egyptian. Now it claims they're a Jewish Messiah, but it says the Egyptian. He's between 52 and 58. There was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former. He was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet. I'm not going to read the rest of that, but he did get a number of men to follow him. And of course, he's going to be defeated as well. Do you remember where he's mentioned in the Bible? You remember after the 3rd missionary journey, Paul has come to Jerusalem with the collection from Macedonia and Achaia, and he's at the temple as James had recommended, and somebody accuses him of taking a Gentile into the temple. Remember that? And while they're trying to rip him apart, here come the Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers don't know what's up. But you remember the confusion? They heard him speak Greek, and they said, they thought he was this Egyptian guy. Aren't you the Egyptian? And that's where Paul says, no, I'm Saul of Tarsus, and I'm a Jew. And he says, let me speak to the people. And then he speaks from the steps to the people. So that's this guy. What are our sources on him? Well, Flavius Josephus and the Bible. So we have Josephus and the Bible. All right, John the Baptist. Well, you know about John the Baptist, and here Josephus talks about John the Baptist. I've mentioned to you in the past how big a figure John the Baptist was, and here's a little bit of what Josephus says. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly is a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him. He was a good man and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, etc., etc., etc. So, what are our sources on John the Baptist? Well, there's the Bible, and they're mentioned something here called a Q document that is not a document they have, but unbelievers speculate a Q document that the Gospels were written from. And the Gospels, Luke says that he did write from other documents. He didn't say one was called a Q document, but if you see Q there, that's what's said about, but I'm not going to go into that. But that would be categorized within literature of the believers, even according to their view. And the other source is what? Antiquities. So our remaining sources on John the Baptist are Josephus and the Bible. All right, let's go to Simon Magus. You know this guy. Acts chapter 8. Philip went to Samaria, and men and women were baptized into Christ, and a certain sorcerer named Simon. That's this guy. All right, so Simon, now he becomes real famous later. In writings of like the 2nd, 3rd century, maybe in the 3rd century and stuff, they talk a lot about him because he supposedly ended up starting some of the Gnostic stuff. I don't know if he did or not, but a lot of Gnosticism gets attributed to him. That's not in the Bible, but it's in later writings circulating among believers. So Simon Magus, Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer, flourished in the 1st century. According to the New Testament in the book of Acts, and there's later references in certain early Christian writings, identify him as the founder of post-Christian Gnosticism. And so here, I need to move that. Justin Martyr talks about him. And he's an early believer writer that's written a lot. There's other writings, other Christian documents of the 3rd century. Clementine literature, which is referred to here as early Christian writings and stuff. So after the 1st century is over, we've got documentation from believers in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century and stuff, and they refer to this guy. So Josephus doesn't, unless it's right here. So far, all we've got is the Bible and later literature from people that believed in Christ. So we'll add that in here for Simon. Some people think that maybe Josephus refers to it. And here it says this: Claudius sent Felix. You remember Felix when Paul's in prison for the 2 years and Festus goes out? Felix is the first one. He's the one that Paul spoke to, and Felix is waiting on the bride. And then later comes Festus. Claudius sent Felix, the brother of Palens, to take care of the affairs of Judea. While Felix was procurator of Judea, he saw this Drusilla and fell in love with her. You remember in the Bible it mentions Felix and Drusilla. He sent to her a person whose name was Simon, one of his friends, a Jew by birth, and he was a Cypriot, one who pretended to be a magician, and endeavored to persuade her to forsake her present husband and marry him. and he promised that if she would not refuse him, he would make her a happy woman. So we find out a little bit here of the backstory, oh, Felix and Drusilla, how'd you guys get together? Well, I got this magician, Simon the Cypriot, to, persuade her to leave her husband and marry me. Is that the same Simon? Well, he's named Simon, and he's a magician. So it might be. But he's a Jew. And Simon in Acts 8 was a what? Samaritan. Also, he's from Cyprus, not Samaria. So we got batting 50% there on the basic details. Well, how common was the name Simon? Think of the Bible. Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the brother of Jesus, Simon's father Judas, Simon the leper, Simon the Pharisee, Simon from Cyrene, Simon the tanner, Simon the prophet, Simon called Niger. If you had a neighbor, it wouldn't have been surprising that one of them was named Simon. Well, were there other magicians? Yes. Remember, we just looked at Theudas, where it says a certain magician named Theudas. And it says this in Antiquities 20. As for the affairs of the Jews, the country was filled with robbers and impostors, deluded the multitude. Felix did catch and put to death many impostors every day. So if you had a bunch of impostors and various magicians and a whole bunch of people named Simon, I doubt, and this guy is not a Samaritan, I don't think this guy is that same one. But here's partly why we chase this rabbit trail. Guess what's in this very same section of Josephus? This. Look at it with me. Now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, remember when Paul gets imprisoned at Caesarea, he's there under Felix, who was married to Drusilla, until Festus comes into power. Felix leaves him, in prison, and then Festus has Agrippa hear him, and Paul ends up appealing to Caesar, right? When Festus dies, there was a chief priest that took advantage of the absence of that Roman power and killed James, the author of your book, James in the Bible, Jesus' brother. And that makes history right here. Josephus tells us about it. Now, Caesar, upon hearing of the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But he can't get there immediately. In between, Ananus, a high priest, thought that he now had a proper opportunity. Festus was dead. Albinus was but on the road. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of law, he delivered them to be stoned. So not only is Jesus recorded in history here, Jesus' brother James is recorded in history. And we find out now how he died. And that's in history. So coming back here to here, Simon Magus, we have him in the Bible. Some people think maybe he's in Josephus, but I think that's a different Simon, and there are a bunch of Simons. But when you chase that rabbit trail, there we see Jesus is in history, and even his brother is in history. And you find out where your brother in Christ, James, what happened to him. Let's proceed. Yeshua ben Hananiah. So this was an important Jewish leader. He was born around the mid-century, so he wouldn't have been alive at the time of Christ. But after the destruction of the temple, he became a leader. And I believe at one point he was the president of the Sanhedrin. So Joshua ben Hananiah was a leading Tana, a wise man of the day among the rabbis there. He's the seventh most frequently mentioned sage in the Mishnah. So you've heard me talk about the Mishnah before. It's rabbinical writings, and then it develops into the Talmud. So if you're reading the Mishnah and it says, Rabbi Joshua said, that's this guy here. He was very prominent. He was a Levite. He had been one of the singers. Levites would do singing stuff. He was an influential leader. and he calmed the people with Aesop's fable. When he doesn't claim to be a Messiah, but he's an influential leader. And I'll give you an example of his leadership. That his temple has been destroyed. Of course, what would the Jews like to do? They would like to rebuild the temple. They asked the Romans for permission to rebuild the temple. The Romans say, no. And you had people thinking, we got to rebuild it anyway. And you had this emotional thing, we're going to defy the Romans, we're going to rebuild it. Well, what Joshua ben Hananiah did, he gave them the Aesop's fable of the lion and the stork, which goes like this. There's a lion and he got a bone stuck in his throat. He was just in a bad way. And with this bone stuck in his throat, he tells all the other animals that he'll give a great reward to whoever will get the bone out of his throat. The stork reaches in, removes the bone. Lion's fine, and the stork says, I want my reward. And he said, here's your reward. You're a stork and you had your head in a lion's mouth and you're still alive. That's your reward. And so Joshua ben Hananiah tells that story to them saying, you know what? We're still alive. Don't overreach right now, this kind of thing. Never claimed to be a Messiah, but he was very, very influential. But look at this. The Talmud records many discussions and debates he had with non-believers, including Emperor Hadrian, who it says he followed to Egypt after Hadrian visited Jerusalem and went elsewhere. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And talks about him talking with Hadrian's daughter. So he's an associate with the Caesar's family. If that's true, do you suppose you're going to find him mentioned in Roman history? No. In fact, I don't even think Josephus is mentioned in Roman history, even though he's associated with Vespasian, and Vespasian treated him well. Not everybody got recorded in Roman history. We're almost done with this list, and then we're going to talk about Jesus for a little bit. It won't take long because it's a 3-minute Bible study that we're going to see, so we'll be done in about 3 minutes. So as soon as we get through Apollonius. So even though he's supposed to have been associated with the emperor, he's still not recorded there. So what's our source of Joshua ben Hananiah? Well, Jewish literature. And why does that make sense? He was a rabbi. He was a leading influential Jew. He's quoted in the Mishnah and stuff. So of course he's recorded there, but not in Roman history. All right, lastly, Apollonius of Tyana. This one is a good one to end on. Apollonius of Tyana, charismatic teacher and miracle worker, 1st century CE. Born in Tyana, he may have belonged to a branch of ancient philosophy called Neo-Pythagoreanism. He received 10 honors in the 3rd degree, blah, 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 blah. There are several bits and pieces of information that may help us reconstruct something of the life of this man who was and is frequently compared to the Jewish sage and miracle worker Jesus of Nazareth. So if you're looking for a parallel to Jesus, here's a guy in the 1st century that supposedly was working miracles. And it says here, is and has been repeatedly compared to Jesus. How do we know about it? The longest and most important source on the life of Apollonius is a book written by Philostratus, who died in was born in 170, died in 245. So stop and get this. If we're going to compare, we'll use this, Jesus and this guy. Here's Jesus, who's making a huge impact on the world in the 1st century. In fact, he's making such a huge impact on the world when Rome burns in 64 and Nero needs to blame it on somebody. Who does he blame it on? Somebody just there by 64. Huge impact. And we've got, of course, the Gospels and epistles and everything. What do we know about Apollonius? Our main source on him is written by a guy that wasn't born until 170. And he would have written it later. He died like 245. So this is over 200 years later from the guy's birth. And why did he write it? This is from Encyclopedia Britannica. Apollonius of Tyana became a mythical hero during the time of the Roman Empire. And why did Philostratus write it? Empress Julia Domna instructed Philostratus to write the biography on. Who is she? She was the wife of one of the Caesars. She died in 217. Her husband was Caesar, she died. He had 2 boys. One of them kills the other one, and now she's the empress, the mother of the other son. It was very influential in that time. When he went off places, she was in charge. And she tells Philostratus, write this biography of this guy. Look why. It is speculated that her motive for so doing stemmed from her desire to counteract the influence of Christianity. So Fitzgerald is saying these guys did something that Jesus never did. He made a dent in history. The only reason he ends up making a dent, apparently, is because the empress is worried about how many people are believing in Jesus. And so she gives them a kind of duplicate to believe in. And it's written down way down here. So, yeah, there's a similarity, but who's the copycat? Now, there may have been some guy, but we don't know much about him, but the main source is down here. So now we finish with this. In addition to the New Testament, wait, this is time, so it really will be 3 minutes. I forgot it's time. 3 minutes and we're done here. Historical references to Jesus Christ. In addition to the New Testament, what references do we have from historical sources? Historical context, we've got the Roman Empire, the Greek culture, and the Jewish people. From the Romans, Tacitus, the Roman historian, says this: Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. That's Roman history. That's a Roman sinner, that's a Roman historian. Note, same time area as Luke 3. Luke says that Jesus was born in the reign of Tiberius, crucified during the reign of Tiberius while Pontius Pilate was governor. Same thing that is recorded in Roman history. Greek, Lucian was a satirist. He didn't like Christians at all, and in his writing about the death of Peregrine, he's talking about the Christians that he don't like, and he's mocking them here. He was born about 120 AD, so it's a little bit later. But he says the Christians, worship a man to this day who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You remember when Paul said to the Greeks, the cross is foolishness? This is a Greek, and he's saying they worship a guy that got crucified. He says these misguided creatures deny the gods of Greece, worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. Jewish, Josephus tells us about Jesus in a first reading, and then later in a second reading about James and Jesus. The second one, except for your mythicists, scholars agree is authentic and real. The first one, scholars agree there's an original part that's real and it got buffed out later. The way we know it got buffed out later is because some words got put in there that Josephus wouldn't have said. We know from early believers talking about Josephus that he wasn't a believer, but somebody put some words in Josephus' mouth where he says he was the Christ, he rose from the dead. Well, that would have made him a believer. So scholars in general all agree, except for your mythicists and stuff, but generally scholars agree that this first section, Josephus wrote some, and then later somebody buffed it up a bit. And so here's a very minimal part of what he said. Josephus, Now there was about this time Jesus. Pilate, it's a suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross. And then the second one, the second reference, is they brought before them, we already read this today, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, and he delivered them to be stoned. So there's two references in Josephus. There's reference in Greek satire, and there's reference in Roman history. The Talmud also, because we got Jewish literature down here, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua, that's Jesus, was hanged. So we got external evidence. Jesus is recorded, of course, by Josephus 2 times, yes, by Tacitus, yes, in the Bible, and yes, in Jewish literature. So it's recorded by the Jews, it's mentioned by this Greek writer, recorded in Roman history, and of course, in the Bible. And the most extensive evidence of Jesus are the New Testament texts themselves, whose very origin and existence would be inexplicable had Jesus not existed. How could you even explain the New Testament if there had not been a Jesus? That's where the detailed records are. The Gospels include narrative of his birth and family, teaching signs, death, and resurrection. Acts includes conflicts with Jesus between over Jesus between Jewish Senate and the apostles and such. The letters include references to birth, teaching, death, and resurrection, etc. John said, which we heard, which we've seen, which we've looked on, which we've touched with our hands. Peter said, we're witnesses of what he did, and we ate to him. Is it just a later legend? Testimony from an early datable text. Richard Carrier says this is early. Richard Carrier says Jesus to Paul was not even a human being. He was some mythical being out there in, the heavenly realm that didn't live on earth. Really? 1 Corinthians 15. I would remind you, brothers, the gospel I preached to you, I delivered to you, which I received. Christ died for our sins, according to Scripture. He was buried. He was buried. He raised from the dead. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom were still alive, though some have fallen asleep. But some of the myths say, see, he appeared. It's just a mythical appearance. No, it's a guy that died and was buried and then appeared. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom were still alive. Then he appeared to James. Last of all, he appeared to me, of course, in that vision. He writes this around 55 AD, and he's reminding what he taught them in 50 AD. That's just 20 years after the death of Jesus, approximately. Died, buried, risen on the 3rd day. Jesus existed. But Jesus did more than exist in history. He changed history. The single most influential person in the history of the world was not a myth. He is and was Christ Jesus of Nazareth. Thank you, and I will not close my talk.